Joining us now, Lieutenant Colonel Jonathan Conricus, spokesman for the Israel Defence Forces. Colonel, great to have you with us this evening, and I am sure you know where we would wish to start. The very sad news that those 3 Israeli hostages being held by Hamas have been killed, and killed in what the IDF is describing, perhaps not using these words, but describing as an incident of friendly fire. What more can you tell us?
Yes, a sad evening. Thank you for having me on the program. What we know so far, and of course we are investigating this event, and we will investigate it thoroughly and be fully transparent with the families of the bereaved. And I want to take this opportunity to express our deepest condolences to the families of these Israeli hostages. What we know so far is that there was fighting on the ground in Sajaiya, northern Gaza, between Israeli troops and Hamas terrorists. After the fighting, the first stage of the fighting, our troops saw a group of men approaching. They perceived a threat, and as a result of that, engaged, opened fire, and shortly after understood that something needed to be verified, and the bodies were taken, and they were then transported back into Israel to be assessed, and it became apparent that there were indeed Israeli hostages that were above ground, dressed in civilian clothes, and were walking towards our troops. Now, what makes this such a tragic incident, and again, we have to make sure that we learn the relevant lessons from what happened. We have already disseminated guidelines for our troops on the ground to make sure that we minimize the risks of this happening again in any other location in Gaza. Because you see, it wouldn't be abnormal. I'm sorry if the connection is choppy. I apologize for that. It wouldn't be abnormal for us to see combatants dressed in civilian clothes. You can see that on Hamas videos as well. They fight while dressed in civilian clothes, sadly.
Sure.
And that, I think, is part of the confusion here that led to this very tragic and sad mistake.
In a roundabout fashion, I suppose one might suggest that this has not happened before now. It is perhaps surprising. From what you've been suggesting, though, Colonel, and you're obviously providing more advice to those troops who are operating in Gaza at the moment, are you saying that you are going to change the way in which your soldiers are operating on the ground when it comes to circumstances like this? I mean, I'm wondering how that might be possible.
Yes, of course, we know that it's not only the British public listening to what we're saying here, but that Hamas will also likely listen in with great interest. So for obvious reasons, I'm not going to go into details what and how we're going to change. I can only say that we have issued guidelines and clarifications for troops on the ground, how to prevent the likelihood of this happening again. I'm not sure, unfortunately, that we will be able to be 100% perfect in the future either. And we will face difficult situations and combat dilemmas. It is a very chaotic environment on the ground that our forces are in, where the enemy uses everything civilian in order to fight against us. And all of the fighting that Hamas conducts is conducted from civilian areas using schools, hospitals, mosques, and everything that you are now showing on the screen. It is ruined because there was fighting there and because Hamas made a decision to fight against us using that civilian infrastructure. And that is the reason why what we're seeing on the screen now.
I have to ask you, as indeed we asked Mark Regev on the programme last week, about the manner in which Israel is prosecuting this war. There is a degree of criticism coming, not simply from an international community that at the General Assembly of the United Nations voted overwhelmingly to allow a ceasefire to take place, but from your allies. The UK's ambassador to the United Nations describing the civilian death toll as shocking. Joe Biden, the US president, referring to your tactics in Gaza as indiscriminate bombing. Does that give you pause for thought about the manner in which your colleagues in the IDF are conducting themselves?
Well, of course, we listen to what leaders and senior officials in democratic countries have to say, their opinions and their concerns. It's important, and I think that there's a very professional and candid dialogue between said elected officials or senior people and their Israeli counterparts.
It's the President of the United States talking about your tactics as indiscriminate bombing. I gently suggest that perhaps suggests a changing in the tide of public opinion amongst Western allies and their leaders.
Yeah, I think that he said Israel needs to be careful not to be perceived as indiscriminately bombing, but the word was there, so let's we can use that as a talking point. I think that we are very, very careful when it comes to attacking and what type of munitions we use. And it really has to be understood that we are fighting in an environment that is extremely challenging, where the enemy is actually, part of his whole strategy is exactly for this conversation to be held, to be speaking about civilian casualties so that they can plead for a ceasefire and live another day and plan another October 7 attack until they're able to wage a complete jihad against Israel. Those aren't my words. Those are the words of senior Hamas officials, Ghazi Hamed and other Mustafa Abu Marzouk, who have said so very clearly that this is what they intend to do. And for once, I think we are now listening to what they're saying, and we are very much inclined not to allow that to happen. Last thing I'll say, there are still more than 250,000 Israelis that have been forced out of their homes and cannot yet return to their homes because it is not safe, because Hamas still exists. And it is our duty to make sure that Hamas is dismantled so that our civilians can go back to their homes. They will do that, and we will bring back all of our hostages.
Lieutenant Colonel Jonathan Conricus, thanks very much for your time. Appreciate it.